Today's class is offered to the general public by the BYU Family History Library. Our presenter is James Tanner, who is a giant in the world of family search and genealogy. He's a deep love of learning and an insatiable appetite for family history topics and research. We welcome you to his class. If you've been there before, you know what I'm talking about. And if you're in for a real treat for those who haven't joined us before. I'm now time to turn the time over to James Tanner. Thank you, James.
Okay. I need to share my screen, so yep, there we go. Just do that again, just a second. Prematurely clicked, there we go. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Good, thanks. The question today is, where did all the records on the FamilySearch website come from? And it's going to start with books, microfilm, and go to digital. And we're kind of a little bit of a history of how all of this came about and how it works. Some of the information that I talk about today comes from this particular book, The Hearts Turn to the Fathers, A History of the Genealogical Society of Utah from 1894 to 1994. It's an interesting book. If you're interested in the book, it is available in used copies on usually on Amazon, and you can find it for fairly inexpensively. As time goes on, these used copies will get used up, and then the price will start going up, and there may not be copies available, but it has been available quite recently. There's three constant challenges that we face. There are probably lots of them in doing a family history. One is the distance and the accessibility and the time. And what that means is that in years past, finding out where your information about your relatives usually required either writing letters or traveling to various locations or hiring professional researchers in other countries like England or Germany or wherever. And the distance was overwhelming. In other words, very few people could travel and live long enough over in a different part of the country to do some adequate research. So it was a great limitation on the amount of research that could be done. Accessibility was still a problem. Well, it was a problem then, and it continues to be a problem, but accessibility meant that the difficulty in finding the records, once you knew where they were and what the records were, you still had to gain access. And gaining access to records historically was an involved process, and it's still quite an involved process. This is still, in my opinion, the number one biggest problem of doing genealogy. You may not be aware of this, but people living in some countries, like for instance in Latin America, where I help people constantly in Spanish, they often very frequently find that the records they're searching for are restricted, meaning they're only viewable under certain circumstances, usually that they're viewable in a FamilySearch family history center. But other times they're only viewable under certain circumstances in a family history center. So those record accessibility is still a problem. And the time involved in doing all this is just astronomical. To acquire that information, when I began this about 40 years ago, was spending a whole week in the Family History Library in Salt Lake City and really not accomplishing much. It took me, I would just gather the information as fast as I could, and then I'd take it home and work on it for a year. So these are kind of constant challenges. And there's some other types of challenges that aren't quite so obvious, and I'll talk about a little bit about those. But I'd like to kind of get a beginning of all this. It all started with books. Sometimes we think that records somehow magically appear. Well, a lot of the genealogical information that we have is available in books, in book format, and published books that date back a couple of hundred years. And so this is the kind of thing that it's important to understand the progression and how we got to where we are today. And when we think about that, we've got to think about libraries. And just as an example, I decided I'd start with the Library of Congress. It was established in April of 24 of 1800, and in the Capitol building, which was burned on August 24th, 1814 by British troops during the War of 1812, which actually happened in a number of years, not just that one year. And up to that point, they had accumulated about 3,000 books and they were all burned. So it's not a kind of a linear progression in acquiring information and establishing what's going on. The big boost in libraries, we sometimes think libraries are somewhat common. They're ubiquitous. They're all over the world. You think everybody has a library. Well, that is relatively, and not only relatively, but quite recently, that happened recently. And very, very few libraries in the United States prior to Andrew Carnegie and his philanthropy. And he established with his own fortune, 1,689 libraries in public and universities in the United States. And then there's other numbers here, 660 in the UK and Ireland and 125 in Canada. And then libraries in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Serbia, Belgium, France, and the Caribbean. This is the first Carnegie Library, and it was in Dunfermline, Scotland. And so they go right, that's really where the whole library system in the United States got its impetus, because previous to that, there were very few libraries available in the sense of more than just a mere collection of books that were perhaps by a school or something like that. Well, if we go forward today, the Library of Congress has about 171 million cataloged items, including 40 million books. Now, in any measure, the Library of Congress is generally, let's call it generally acknowledged as the largest library in the world. And you need to kind of keep that in mind here as we talk, because that kind of figure is a little bit, it's not understated, but it's not understood particularly well. So first of all, if you were to go to the Library of Congress, like I did just a couple of years ago and spent some time there, you would not find 40 million books, because they just all wouldn't fit in that one building. That's an old picture of, black and white picture of the Library of Congress, but many years ago, but the building's the same. The actual books are stored offline in a couple of large warehouses that are climate controlled, obviously, for all the books. And you don't just walk into the Library of Congress and check out a book like you would in a public library, like a local public library. You walk into the library and then you have to qualify to become a reader in the library. And that takes you sitting through a kind of instructional session. And then as qualified reader, that gives you access to the portion of the library that's open stacks. And that is rather limited. Realistically, anything you're actually looking for will take 2 or 3 or 4 days. You do your research in advance, is how you work with the library like this. And you have all the things you want to look at. And then when you get there, you fill out all these cards for request. And then they bring those in and put those into the library for a period of time. So you may spend, my estimate is that you would spend a minimum of 2 weeks before you could actually do any kind of significant research in the Library of Congress. So that's kind of when I go back to those three statements about accessibility, you'll see even though this library is huge and it has a huge collection, the accessibility is not extremely easy. It's not easily accessible. And it's also a long ways away. If we look at a map, you can see I'm quite a distance, or we here in Provo, I'm sitting quite a distance away from Washington, D.C. And so my access to the Library of Congress is extremely limited to those days and those times that I happen to be in Washington. My wife and I were fortunately, as we'll talk about a little later, served a mission in Maryland, living in Annapolis and digitizing records at the Maryland State Archives. And that gave us an opportunity to spend considerable time down in Washington, D.C., and also have some pretty interesting access to the Library of Congress. So this is, this is kind of the idea of what we were looking at as we talk about FamilySearch and the collections that we have with FamilySearch. Now let's kind of jump ahead to the present. This is today. This is today. Today we have the internet. Today we have the opportunity, if you're saying, well, I have limited internet capabilities. The public library system in the United States is one of the basic places where people can go and get internet access for free. And you will see a lot of people using the internet access in a public library. But one website that you may not be acquainted with is the Internet Archive. It's called archive.org, archive.org. And it is the Internet Archive. And one of the things that it has been doing for many years now is digitizing books. And they managed to digitize about it looks to me like more than about 1 million a year. So they've been adding books considerably. And presently, there are 34,642,129 books on here. Now, these books and these records that are on here that are basically totally searchable. So if you go on there, you can search for names, you can search words, you can search anything you want to in this entire collection. Interesting, huh? And if you think about the number that I just mentioned a moment ago, about 40 million books in the Library of Congress, and you know the speed at which the Internet Archive is digitizing those records, including books from the Library of Congress and all around the world, you'll see that very quickly, maybe in the next couple of years, the Internet Archive may pass, and that's only books that they have. They have billions of other records on here. And they may very well pass the Library of Congress as the largest library in the world. And the interesting thing is, often, if you go on to Google Books, for example, that has millions of books, you'll find the problem. They'll say, oh, this book's copyrighted, you can't see it. Or you'll go to FamilySearch and they'll say, oh, you can't, this book is copyrighted, you can't see it. Well, on the Internet Archive, they've kind of solved that problem, because what they do is they make agreements with all the providers of the books, and they check them out. Just like you go into a library and check out a book for 2 weeks, you go here and you find the book you want and you register for free and you check it out for free for 2 weeks. Then it checks itself back in. You don't have to worry about it. You can read it and see it online. So as we go into, you'll see this as kind of the trend here, that the issue of accessibility has now been basically solved for a huge number of books. And the distance, the time it takes, none of those factors are any longer serious factors. I can say I use the Internet Archive as much as any other website for doing research. It did some research today with my wife over about one of her family lines, the Pettit line from Long Island. And most of the information we found was in was in books that where people had done the research on that family previously, and they were all on the Internet Archive, the ones we found. Okay, or on some other website, digitized. Now, let's kind of jump to a different subject, because this gives us some perspective, a little bit perspective about FamilySearch. Before 1844, there were no organized genealogical societies in the United States. Well, there were no genealogical societies anywhere. This was not a concept that anybody understood. So what happened is in December of 1844, there was formed the New England Historic Genealogical Society was formed, and that is a genealogical society, and that was formed in Boston, Massachusetts, and as a result, they began to accumulate. And this picture here is a picture of the New England Historic Genealogical Society library in Boston. And they have a huge collection of records, primarily from New England, but they're expanding into other areas, and it's a growing thing. And now there are hundreds of societies around the world. This is a screenshot of a page from the FamilySearch Research Wiki. Up under the search tab, if you go to familysearch.org and click on the search tab, you'll find the FamilySearch Research Wiki, which is an invaluable source now of over 100,000 articles on all the records that exist in almost every country in the world. So this is and every state and every county and a lot of cities and all sorts of records in here. It's just a marvelous resource for finding information and understanding what genealogical information is available. So this is the kind of work that genealogical societies can do. You're basically not using the resources that are available when you start focusing entirely upon what's online, in the sense of what's in the larger family history websites like FamilySearch and Find My Past and Ancestry and MyHeritage, etc. Because a lot of the local information that is available about where your ancestors may have lived may only be available in history societies and in genealogical societies, historical and genealogical societies. So this is a kind of a checklist of them by state. And one thing that's very important to do in other countries also is to see if there's a historical or genealogical society active in that particular country that you're interested in researching. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints began formal involvement in genealogical affairs with the formation of the Genealogical Society of Utah, which was organized on the 13th of November in 1894. And the charter members contributed 11 volumes. And it's was established in the church office building at the time, and then moved a few times until it's now housed in a very large building on West Temple in Salt Lake City. And understanding this, that FamilySearch is actually the Genealogical Society of Utah. So a few years ago, around in the early 70s and into the 80s, Genealogical Society of Utah decided to use a trade name, and they trademarked a trade name called FamilySearch. And then FamilySearch became, in a sense, the Genealogical Society of Utah, which still exists, but and it's still a trade name. But now there is a FamilySearch International, which is a corporation which is wholly owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and is now the successor in interest, you might call it, if you're talking about legal things, of the Genealogical Society of Utah. there are many reasons for having a separate organization for genealogy, and the least of which involves having to enter into contracts and agreements with the whole spectrum of people who hold the various records around the world. None of this is obtained by simply making offers. It's a matter of negotiation. In many places around the world, the people who control or, in a sense, own the records, the governments and the other organizations that have records, have decided and have understood that they can charge money for people to look at those records, because there are people out there who will pay money to look at their records. So why would they give them to FamilySearch so that FamilySearch could put them on their website so that everybody could view them for free? And so we have this very complex negotiation process going on where additional records are obtained and made available. And that gives you some basis for the problem that I mentioned a few minutes ago about records being restricted to viewing under certain circumstances. If you make the record viewable only in a family history center, then people will still have to make some effort to go see the record. And so they may very well decide to pay for them rather than travel to a family history center or whatever. So there's lots of different considerations going on here. Now we're going to kind of move to a different category, because we're still focusing on the issue of accessibility and whether or not the records are readily available and the time it might take to obtain or look at those records. And so we begin another section, which is microphotography, and Dr. John Benjamin Dancer, a scientist, sold microphotographs as slides to be viewed with a microscope. And in a Frenchman, René Dagrand, patented microfilm in 1859. You might think microfilm's been something that's just invented recently. Well, it's been around for a couple hundred years. So microfilm is something that was always used, but it wasn't used for, it was only used for very, very limited purposes. It was, first of all, it was rather expensive. And secondly, interest in looking at little tiny things was something that people like to do, but it wasn't something that anybody had thought about. It began to be used for spies and international transportation of documents in encrypted type documents, because in putting it in a microfilm, they could shrink it down to a very small size, and then they could put it in, it didn't appear to have to be a document, and you could transport a lot of information that way. So what happened, though, is that the Genealogical Society of Utah saw the advantages of having microfilm. And so they began in 1938 the process of systematically microfilming records around the world. It started out rather slowly, but gathered steam. And eventually what happened was that the microfilm collection grew into over 2.4 million rolls of microfilm. And this microfilm is a physical roll of film, and it has a shelf life. Fortunately, the shelf life is about 500 years. So it lasts a long time and under good conditions. And so in order to preserve those good conditions, the Genealogical Society of Utah built what's called the Granite Vault up in a Little Cottonwood Canyon just east of Salt Lake City, Utah. In the side of the canyon, which is solid granite, they dug in a series of tunnels, very large tunnels that are used for storing microfilm and other records under optimal conditions with the humidity and the temperature and everything that's controlled because it's under solid rock. And so this was the effort to preserve all of this information. And in order to make it usable, they realized that they could make copies of the microfilm. And so they began copying the microfilm and sending the microfilm out into the family history centers. Well, family history centers actually began in 1962 with the establishment of the Family History Center at Brigham Young University, in the Brigham Young University Harold Bealey Library. So 1962 was the first family history center, and that's for the BYU. Now, BYU Family History Library is no longer a family history center per se. It is part of the Brigham Young University. It is part of the Brigham Young University library system. Those of us who serve there are as missionaries, are part of, are simply volunteers at the library on the BYU campus. But there are over 5,000 family history centers around the world. Well, FamilySearch had developed, the Genealogical Society of Utah, the FamilySearch, had developed a huge system for a mechanized warehouse full of microfilm that for sending out microfilm requests around the world to all the different family history libraries and family history centers out there. And that was a mammoth operation. Many years ago, I got the chance of having a tour of the whole facility, and it was very impressive. They had big mechanized things that would go up, pull off the tray of microfilm, and then the tray would be read automatically, and they would pull out the right film, and it would be separated out, and then it would be verified and then packaged and put in for shipment out to the family history centers. Basically, they weren't working off the originals, they were working off of copies, and so they would have to copy all the microfilm if there were the same microfilm rolls were needed in 5 different places. They'd have to make 5 copies. Excuse me. So basically, this was kind of a mammoth undertaking. It made the records accessible at one level. Now, here's the catch. Obviously, when you look at a roll of microfilm, and unless the original records contain some kind of an index, you were forced to look at the records page by page by page and read through the entire record. And it's not unusual for a roll of microfilm to have well over 2,000 images. So if you had one record, for instance, a year's record, and it was 2,000 or 4,000 or more images, you would still be spending a tremendous amount of time looking through the microfilm. And so this is where I made my entrance into the genealogical research situations, and spent considerable early years, spent an enormous amount of time looking at microfilm, but beyond that, spending time getting the records copied because there was no real practical way to copy those records. Okay, so now they had to catch up with the technology. So if we have back the stage, if we roll back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we were in a situation where the ability of individuals to do genealogical research was limited dramatically by the time and the availability and the accessibility of getting the records and looking at the records. So there were 2 things that needed to change. First of all, there had to be a more efficient way of doing the photography. The photography at the time was film photography. And I've been involved in photography for practically my whole life. And film photography is marvelous. It's a wonderful way of doing images. But when you click a photograph, you have 1 copy. And in order to get more copies, you have to make a photographic copy of every copy. And so it's expensive, and it's very time consuming. So we really hadn't solved the problem with microfilm. And the second part of it was that back in the 1960s and 1970s and into the 80s, computers were evolving, and that technology was beginning to affect the way people transferred information. In the beginning of the 1980s, they began to connect computers together. A thing called the ARPANET, which was a US military computers network, was created, and that's the genesis of the internet, which grew from that early internet limited network. And so all of that was sort of developing during this time period. So what happened? Well, we've got to go back a few more years, and that is in 1890, Herman Hollerith invented a punch card system, and that was invented for processing the 1880 US federal census. One of the things that the genealogy is completely involved in is looking at records which involve massive amounts of information. When we go today, which routinely will go out and you can look at a US Census record, we're in the middle of at this point with this class, we're in the middle of indexing and checking the indexing of the 1950 US Census. And it's going to take probably a few months to do that. But back then, to go through the US Census in 1880 was a tremendously difficult process. And anything done by hand took a massive amount of labor and time. And so Hollerith began the process of mechanizing that by creating machines that would allow them to analyze the information in the US Census, and from our standpoint, to do research in the US Census with punch cards. So now we're clear out there, and he founded a number of companies, and they were consolidated in 1924 into a company called International Business Machines, or IBM. Now, the first fully automatic digital electronic or electromechanical computer, and there are any number of computers out there that claim to be the first computer, but this is the one that's kind of generally accepted now as the first fully automatic digital computer, and that was made by Konrad Zuse back in called the Z3 in 1941 in Bavaria. This is a replica of that machine. During the war, that area was bombed, and all except for one of the original machines was destroyed. And so there's lots of claims back and forth about the first computer. And they actually go back to a man by the name of Babbage, who developed the idea of programming back in the 1800s. But by most measures, the first really automatic computer, what we'd call a mainframe computer, was the Harvard Mark I. And they started to build it in the 1930s, and it took about 10 years for this computer to be built. And it weighed 5 tons, and it filled an entire room, and cost $200,000 at the time, which comes out to a little over $3 million today, or more. And it was one of a kind. There's only one of them. And to understand its limitations, it had 60 sets of 24 switches for manual data entry, and could store 72 numbers in each of 23 decimal digits long. Now, there are any number of handheld calculators, including the one in your phone, that will do more than that. So you can imagine what kind of process there's been. The first desktop computer was the Altair 8899, and it was featured in a Popular Electronics magazine article in January of 1975 as a kit. So they sold these in parts and had you, the user, the guys who bought them all, who bought these, put them together. And all the programming was done with the little switches on the front and the little lights lit up, and you had to read off the results by knowing what the lights meant. It was kind of interesting. Later this 1975 is kind of the beginning of the modern age of what you'd call microcomputers or desktop computers, or any number of names that have been used. Today, if you talk about a desktop computer, you're probably talking about a box that you buy. And if you're talking about a laptop or a portable mobile computer, you could have anything from your phone to an iPad or any kind of tablet. So it's a little bit more, back then there were no mobile computers, there was only this beginning. Just kind of a fast forward, don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. Apple introduced its new Studio desktop computer about a month ago now. It has a 20-core CPU, which means it's the same as having 20 computers sitting on your desk, 20 separate processors. And it has a 64 general processing unit and a 32-core neural engine. So it's got a lot of computers in there, and you can put in up to 8 terabytes of storage. And the cost of this computer, if you loaded it up with all that, would be about $5,000. So compared to the millions of dollars that were being spent previously, it's a pretty good deal. Now, what did all this do? Well, now we had computers, and we had the byproduct of the computer was we were able to have worldwide networks of computers that we call the internet, and basically we were able to use that information. So this had to have an effect on the genealogical community, and it especially did because the companies who were involved in genealogy, primarily FamilySearch and Ancestry, and now most lately MyHeritage and Find My Past in England, all of these big companies came about and were enabled in a sense by the fact that this technology had changed. And it would be interesting to note that the first digital cameras were developed by a Kodak engineer named Stephen Sasson in 1975. So these numbers all seem to be coming out at the same time. And that's because as we've been able to have these capabilities, this progress of capabilities has only been enabled by all of these different pieces coming together and making it possible for us to have the vast amount of information that we have today for genealogical research. And this was the first, officially the first digital camera. It was a 400 kilopixel CCD, or charge coupled device. So you can tell that that's what you would call a very, 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 very low resolution camera from that standpoint. So today, fast forward, you could buy a camera with 150 megapixel sensor. That's not a kilo or gigapixel, but megapixels. And that one, this is an example of a 150 megapixel camera system. Yes, it's about that big. Okay, so with that technology coming together, the Genealogical Society of Utah began making digital images of the record in 1998. This was, let's call it an experimental sort of trial process. The questions that were being raised by the engineers who worked for FamilySearch were, well, where are we going to store all this information? Where are we going to, how much resolution do we need to adequately represent or adequately show a record that would be useful. What file formats do we want to put these records in, and how are we going to store the records on where are we going to store them? How are we going to make them available to people? And all of those questions had to be answered. And as they worked through those, they came up with a system over the years that was involved. Part of the system was developing the software that would handle the images. In other words, you've got a camera. So we've worked through the technology that and have a camera. And at the time that they began doing this, the cameras were running at about anywhere from 3 or 4 to 10 megapixels. Today, the average smartphone has a 12 megapixel camera. And some of the smartphones coming out now and shortly in the next year or two will be kicking that up to 50 megapixel cameras. And so there's just, the resolution of the camera has been resolved. There's no, I shouldn't have said that way, but anyway, it made as inconsequential because inexpensive cameras now have the resolution necessary to do this. FamilySearch, on the other hand, had to go to commercially cameras to get that, and they were very expensive at the time. And as time evolves, the cameras have become less expensive and they've become easier to use, and all sorts of things have happened. One interesting side note was that during this process, back in about 12 or 15 years ago, I was involved with FamilySearch sort of by accident in being the beta tester, being the person who tested the software for making digital images on site on records. I spent about 2.5 years in the Mesa City Cemetery making images, sending them to FamilySearch, having them send back, changing the film out, going back and forth with equipment and everything until I finally created a set of documents that are the Mesa City cemetery records that are now on FamilySearch. And interestingly enough, they are the only color images that are on FamilySearch so far. So it's kind of an interesting process. Anyway, so so this is kind of when I started to get more and more involved in the whole process. Now, this camera setup that you see here, this was our camera setup at the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, Maryland. And on the right-hand side, you can see right up above, you can see the big lights that were used to illuminate the objects, the books and records that we were doing. You'll see kind of wedges on the side. We had to level out books and the records so that they were absolutely level, and that required us to, as we turn pages, to keep adjusting the camera so that it came out properly. And then as the images, the camera was up there in the camera stand. It's the thing with the lens on it. And it was connected electronically to a computer, which is sitting down in the left-hand corner. You can see the blue light on the front of the computer. And then there was a switch, which is the little box on the side of the desk there that has the 3 stripes on it. And so when we were ready to take a picture and had it ready, we just touched that. It would take the picture, restore it on the computer, put it onto a storage hard drive, and we would just keep going. During the time we were there, we had 4 cameras operating, and of the 4 cameras, the estimate that we made after 1 year of being there was that the 4 of us jointly took about 2 million photographs, or 2 million records pages of records were added. So now, all of that, what happened is that all of those digital records started to pour into FamilySearch, and then FamilySearch began a massive project to digitize all their existing microfilms. So they used high-resolution cameras to take pictures of the microfilm images and then turn those into digital images. And that process started out estimating to take about 30 years, and it ended up taking about 6 years to do, which was an alder increase in the technology. So after 83 years, they finally announced in September of 2021, during the middle of the pandemic, yes, they had finished digitizing 2.4 million rolls of microfilm. Unfortunately, as we'll get past, that was only the first part of the problem, and they still are in the process of processing all those 2.4 million rolls. And now you have all of these records for free on FamilySearch, sort of. I say that qualifiedly. So here's the process. FamilySearch goes out and it negotiates contracts with the libraries and archives. I talked about that just kind of briefly when I mentioned restricted records. This is a long, drawn-out process, and it involves the process of FamilySearch trading the free duplication of the records and providing the repository, the archives, library, or whatever, with a free copy of the set of records, which helps to back up the records and prevent further record loss through all of the mechanical things and of moisture and insects and fire that can occur to destroy records. And then that has solved a lot of those records. But on the other hand, it does take time and effort and money on part of the archives. So that's kind of a negotiation process. Then the camera operators come in with their cameras, which are set up by FamilySearch, and they have to prepare the documents for digitization. So you get a pile of documents like this, and you've got to do something with it to keep it in order. You certainly don't want to mess up whatever cataloging order that they have them in, and you can tell they're just, really careful about the way they store stuff. And so it's just really, you got to remember, you want to give them back to them in exactly the same shape, but we hope that we gave them back to them in a little better shape than that. But they had to be prepared, which is very time consuming. That's not, and none of that's automatic, because each one of those pieces of paper has to be handled individually. And then their records are actually digitized on site. So you're in there as a guest digitizing records. And this is a shot of the Maryland State Archives building. And the archives were in the back of that building, if you're looking towards the back of that part of the building, and huge multi-story storage areas. And the digitizing we did was in a kind of a small room up in the kind of the top floor of the building. And because of the nature of where we were, it had to be completely dark. So the only thing we had, the lights we had, were those big lights for the cameras. So you just, kind of like living in the dark and doing this for day after day. Yes, it was hard work. And then the records are carefully digitized, like this beautiful record from Maryland, and the lovely script. Some of these were fabulous records. And then as those pictures were taken, they were loaded on a hard drive. So that image there took it. Later, we got two monitors sections, and that helped us because we were able to kind of look at the programs and manage the programs at the same time we were taking the images. So this is kind of the setup where we would stand or sit all day and turn pages or move documents. Then the images are saved onto hard drives and shipped to Salt Lake City for processing. And then what happens to all those records? Well, this is when they kind of contemporaneous at the same time this was going on, a little bit earlier. FamilySearch announced the end of the microfilm loan program. Now, why did that occur? Well, up to that point, what FamilySearch had determined was that all of the records that had been ordered from FamilySearch during the previous 5 years had been digitized and made available online. So at that point, they said there's no more purpose to spend this entire bunch of money sending out microfilm, because only thing that's ever been ordered for the last 5 years has already been digitized and available. So that began the process of adding a second part of that that made the records accessible, and that was indexing the records. And that's an ongoing process, which now is being done particularly with the 1950 census records by artificial intelligence and computer digitizing, computer indexing. And surprisingly, if you've become involved, which you can, to get involved off of the FamilySearch website, which now has a menu item called Get Involved. And then you can participate in checking the computer, and you'll find out that it does a pretty good job. And it's pretty quick to do many hundreds of records because the computer has really done it correctly. Now, here's the kind of the end of the story today. The end of the story today is that FamilySearch now has over 300 cameras in operation, and it's producing about 80 million images a year. And that didn't decrease significantly during the pandemic, because this was a project that was given priority in many cases, and where it wasn't, they could move cameras over to where they could do the work. And so it became, it was continued, and it goes on every day. Now, what happens to those images? Unfortunately, that number of images coming in every year is far exceeds the capabilities presently of indexing or cataloging. And so all of those images coming in, pouring in day after day, are being poured into this part of the FamilySearch website. So a couple of years ago, a number of us prevailed on FamilySearch to let us see the raw images, and they were really hesitant because they said, oh, nobody will know what they're doing or whatever. We say, we know what we're doing, we'd be glad to have them. So they have dumped, that's a technical term, all of these images onto the website in this huge historical images collection. Now it says search up there. You click on search, and the second item is images. Takes you to this page. You'll see a counter there telling you how many images or how many pages of images or images are coming in. And you can, some of these images have 1,000 names on them. So, you know, the number of names is astronomically larger. And then they're just put in there by geographically, by image type, by the subject of the images and the date. And then you are going to go page by page through those images to find what you want. But that gives you that access to this. So now this access, so all of the conditions have been completed, and you do have access, and they're all available online. And the numbers coming in are far greater than the time anyone has to look at all of them. And so you're basically, if you haven't looked under the images section for the areas of your interest, whether you're from looking in a city or a state or province or wherever it is in the world, you're going to find additional images there that you have never looked at. And never been available previously. And they're being added every single day of the year, every minute that we sit here. Okay, so that's the story, and that's where we are today, and that's how we got there. Any questions?
Elder Tanner, there's one in the Q&A. Roger's asking, in the Granite Mountain Vault, do they also keep backup copies of all the digital records inside of FamilySearch.org?
Okay, well, the records on FamilySearch.org, this is where you see how interesting how the technology has still not got to the point. They actually do a microfilm backup of all of the information on the FamilySearch website, including the family tree and all of the records, at least once a day. And they may do it more frequently, but it goes on to microfilm. So there's a transfer process. They transfer all of those images onto microfilm, and then they put the microfilm and store it in the Granite Vault. They still haven't come up with a more permanent record, and that gives them an ultimate backup. In addition, all the information on FamilySearch is backed up to the cloud. on multiple servers around the world. So there's a huge backup system going on every day. And usually the family tree is usually backed up about 5 times a day. That's what I've heard. And so it's, yeah, there's a great effort there made to preserve all that information. Anything else?
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording, and if anyone has anything else, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A.